Commercial is like the exact opposite, right? So I want a 5-year triple net, like I don't want to ever have to mess with it. And, I just wanted like constant income.
Right.
And that's also what helps the value of commercial properties. So it's a different metric.
Welcome to the Cash Flow Chronicles. I'm your host, Johnny Catani, and the founder of Catani Capital Group. For the last 2 years, I've been studying alternative assets and now help solve the problem of creating passive cash flow for creators, influencers, and busy professionals by bringing you 5 episodes a week of easy to understand education in the world of passive investing. What's up, guys, and welcome to another episode of the Investor Relations Real Estate Podcast. I'm your host, Johnny Catani, and I'm joined today by Jeff Schechter. Jeff, or Shecky, as his friends call him, has had a lifelong interest in real estate investing. He house hacked in the 80s before the term was even coined. In 2016, he co-founded a turnkey company, and since then has evolved into numerous ventures, including short-term rentals, medium-term rentals, and a property management company, construction company, and joint ventures with a host of companies that service investors. He's building a sizable portfolio with his 2 business partners, and he has helped hundreds of investors build out their portfolios too. Shecky, welcome to the show.
Thank you, brother. Appreciate it. Happy to be here.
Absolutely. We're happy to have you. We're having an awesome offline conversation, so excited to get into it. We kind of alluded here how you got into it, right? House hack back in the 80s before it was even house hacking. It's fascinating it took time for that to become something, because I feel like really all you're doing is buying a house and renting out the rooms. And I think people have been doing that for a long time, but you did it before it was cool, we'll say. So what led to that? Was that kind of, you noticed real estate back then, and what kind of led you to where you're at now?
Yeah, I wasn't doing a whole lot of room renting. I just sort of had an interest in design and, just kind of layouts of homes. And I always like, oh, wow, that's a cool house, and so I always had an interest in it. And what I would do is I would find houses that had some really interesting feature or unique character to them. And I'd say, okay, like, could I put my touch on it? So I would live in it for a year or 2, or sometimes 3. And unfortunately live through a war zone. And, but there was a financial payoff on the backside of that, of being able to ultimately sell it. I would almost always keep it long enough that I didn't have to pay the higher tax rates. And then I would, yank some equity out and move on to the next one. And I had the luxury, of course, of being single and not having wife and kids and responsibilities of family. So that gave me a little bit more flexibility to do that stuff. So I just took advantage of it.
That's awesome. I love it. And since then have obviously, grown a sizable portfolio. You have other ventures going, including what we were talking about offline. You purchased a CPA firm and really now focus on tax strategy for real estate investors. I've talked about it before on this podcast, had CPAs on. Obviously, a lot of tax incentives around real estate, some obvious, some not so obvious. So let's kind of get into it. First, I guess, what prompted you to even, purchase the firm and kind of go down that road?
Well, I have some business partners that have or already owned tax firms and had actually some other things that were nicely geared towards serving real estate investors. So we already had a bit of an ecosystem, but I have a background in digital marketing. And over the last couple of years, we've just seen some astronomical increases in cost of advertising, clicks, things like that. And of course, as you can imagine, in the investing and financial space, doing advertising to a cold market and trying to figure out those costs there's a lot of money and a lot of dollars in testing. So we started looking at those costs in relation to what it would cost us for, say, a down payment to buy a tax firm. And we ended up buying a tax firm here locally. It was a guy they're a retiring CPA, and we have some different mixes of equities with myself and my partners. And but it was really interesting to see an aging baby boomer exiting. And I was telling you before, we had, I think, 1,250 clients, and about 420 of them were pretty successful business owners. And not one of these business owners were getting any kind of real tax strategy. So they were using, of course, the typical American shoebox theory, whether that's on paper or digital, doesn't matter. I still use the term to say all the information is gathered like, look, Mr. CPA, here's what I did all year. I bought this property. I did this, I'm assuming I'm going to get some good write-offs, and they hand all this information over to the CPA and they just go into heavy prayer mode. And, but what's interesting about that is that then the CPA basically, and most of the CPAs think and know that they're doing a good job. And I'm not saying that they're not. I think they're good people and their heart's in the right place. But that whole structure is based on them simply being a historian, right? Like the events have already happened. There is no pre-planning. There is no strategy ahead of time. So when we acquired this company, we started saying, like, how could we reach out to, especially the 400 or so business owners, and say, what is it that we can do to restructure and get aggressive about your tax base? And it's not always a real estate conversation, but as you know from being in the real estate world, we enjoy as real estate investors some just incredible opportunities to save money on taxes and delay things and depreciation schedules and all this really cool stuff. So a really, really good tax strategist and is somebody that's actually very, very proactive and understands these laws, understands the nuances of it, but the better ones are able to actually look at somebody's tax returns, what they've been paying so far, where they have all their assets spread out, how the assets are spread out. In other words, is it personal or is it in an LLC or partnership or whatever? In other words, how is it being currently reported to the IRS? And can look at that and say, hey, I could give a really, really good analysis and say, we can save you a lot of taxes if you did X, Y, and Z. And just open up a lot of opportunities for people. So we've been getting more into that stuff. And it's fantastic, obviously, because we're in the real estate business. So a lot of our business model, aside from building our own portfolios, is we do sell to other investors. And we kind of do it in a three-tiered effect. We've kind of three different programs, depending on the level of sophistication of the investor. So it's really been great because it's really fostered some great conversations. And, now we're leading with some incredible value as far as what we can offer potential clients, and not necessarily have to spend all the money on, Facebook or, any of these other ridiculously expensive platforms that are, in my opinion, overcrowded with competition. And it's really very, very hard to stand out from the crowd. So, when we own the tax firm, it's like, well, you're already our client. We're just going to massage some of the messaging that you've gotten previously. And as we go through this changeover, we're just going to say, okay, these are the things that we can offer now that were never offered to you before. So let's take advantage of it. Let's meet face to face. We've been doing a lot of face to face stuff, and it's freaking awesome. It's like the whole world is online, and it's so great to see, because at the end of the day, people still, you still want to connect with humanity. And, it's a beautiful thing. So I really appreciate those meetings.
Yeah, absolutely. It is fascinating, right? It is, and it's awesome that we've been able to leverage technology, obviously, and move forward, right? I mean,
Yeah.
had this been, this pandemic been 20 years ago, it'd have been a much different landscape, obviously. So grateful for that, but I'm with you there. Being able to meet in person is it's just different, right? It's it's subjective, but I'm with you. I think it's better. I think being able to really, you just get a better idea of who someone is, right?
Yeah.
And I love that. So that's awesome. And obviously now, like you mentioned, the tax strategies that are involved. And it is fascinating, and I love that you brought it up. That strategy involves actually sitting down and sort of planning out how you're actually going to operate throughout the year, right? Not just, hey, here's everything that I did this year. Here's my all my K1s and my 1099s and blah, 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 figure out where I can save money. It's no, let's actually figure out how to operate your life so that you're maximizing, your incentives, whether that's, full on tax breaks or, deferrals, whatever it may be. So what are some of the big ones that you guys really like to utilize for strategy?
Well, I'm actually the wrong guy to ask that question. So, yeah, no, it's a great question. I tend to leave it to the tax strategist, and I use the word strategy on purpose.
Right.
What's interesting is that I can give you a nuance of what comes out of this. So
Awesome.
That's maybe a better way to approach the question. When somebody comes to us to buy real estate, because that's really the first look at us for the most part, they're obviously going, well, I know I can get some deductions, and they're almost always, and I don't fault them for this, but they're almost always looking at the returns of the property. Mm-hmm. So it's all about stuff that is external to them, right? So what's the neighborhood like? What kind of rents am I going to get? We're on the residential side. So what are the rents we're going to get? What are the crime rates in that neighborhood? I mean, is it good for a short-term rental, medium-term rental, whatever, right? So we're going through all that stuff, and it's a numbers crunching thing. And of course, they should be doing their due diligence, but almost never when they first come to us are they turning around and pointing it towards themselves to say, like, well, what's going on with you? How much money do you make? How much money do you have in a 401k? Are you in a qualified plan? Are you investing out of that? How much did you pay in tax last year? How are you buying these properties? Are you doing it in your personal name, in an LLC? So there's so many different variables there that what ends up happening, and the nuance is that when somebody really starts understanding that tax has such a big implication to their investing, right? The needle gets moved more on any deal by the tax than it does by the return of the property. Now, I know I'm saying something that people are going to probably write to you and go, who's this loser you had on your show? But we are seeing it in real life. I mean, I just visited with an investor, I don't know, maybe 2 weeks ago. And, this guy paid about $100K in taxes last year. I mean, I'm not going to divulge any names, whatever. He does well, right?
And this is his social. Just kidding.
What's that?
I'm saying, and this is his social security number.
Yeah, right. No, we're gonna leave him nameless for now, but just by way of an example. And right. So when we started working with this guy and restructured some things for him, he bought it was roughly a $300,000 property from us, but it needed quite a bit of work. So we put about 150 in it, and then he's subsequently going to build another ADU, additional dwelling unit, on this property. Probably by the time he gets all done, over the course of the year, he'll have about $700K in the property. It'll be worth about $950 when it's done, right? But so what ends up happening is now, instead of paying $95,000 to the IRS this year, like he did last year, he's going to pay about $3,000. Okay, wow. So you start looking at that and factoring that into his cost of rehab or cost of property. I don't care. You take it out of the total, whatever, right? And now all of a sudden, boy, that really shifts the numbers on the return. So if he hadn't have done that and just bought the property, he likely would have still been paying approximately that same amount. Right now, he would have gotten some deductions here and there, but because of the way that the tax strategist taught him to structure things and structure a whole lot of other things in his life, aside from just how this property is being purchased, he was able to realize that difference. So that's a good real world example. And, it can happen outside of real estate, but there's just so many more opportunities within real estate, especially in real estate that requires rehab. because then you start getting into cost seg and all that other stuff. And,
Absolutely.
it's typically a play for a little bit more sophisticated investor, but that's okay. And so, it works out. And so there's like, we started as a turnkey company and just providing inexpensive, $50,000 to $100,000 properties in Indianapolis. And we've obviously branched out to plenty of other markets and things like that. But that was good for a beginner, for somebody that hasn't really invested before and doesn't really understand or know the ropes. Take some standard deductions, get a little bit of return, get your feet wet, see what it's like, have tenants, even if it's professionally managed, which it should be if you're out of state. So there's rungs that make sense for different investors. And the stuff that I'm talking about is probably a little bit more sophisticated investor, but there are some things you can do for the in-between people as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, like I was saying offline, I was a stockbroker for a long time. So, worked in the stock market. And, by no means am I a CPA or a tax strategist or anything professional of that. But I do believe that real estate has the most incentives when it comes to IRS, code and from what I've seen, right? So like, for instance, deductions, you can only take up to a $3,500 loss per year from the stock market, whereas it's infinite when it comes to real estate and even in a business, right? So, you have that. You mentioned cost segregation, obviously a huge one, obviously top of mind for a lot of sophisticated investors, as this is the last year of 100% bonus depreciation. So a lot of investors really trying to plug into deals this last quarter. Take advantage of that final year of bonus depreciation. And even at 80%, that's still going to be incredible. And of course, hopefully they take a look at that and we don't get too far down. I would love to see it come back to 100. But again, not to get too sophisticated, although we do have a lot of sophisticated investors who listen. A lot of advantages there available. And, when it comes to these strategies, it's funny, you brought up the guy who paid 100,000. I have a friend who's also an investor of mine, and, his CPA literally told him after tax season, she's like, you need to invest in real estate. Because he works in enterprise sales and, high income earner, but that commission just gets hammered. Right.
Yeah.
And so you see, you find these people and realize that, they didn't even know that this stuff was available to them. So a lot of it is just educating people. And I can't imagine how many light bulbs, you and your CPAs have seen go off when people realize these strategies that are available.
Yeah, this firm that we just acquired, it's interesting because right now we are running super high. I don't know what the numbers are, but super high on personal referrals. So as we started converting over and telling the client base that, there's an acquisition and the old guy is retiring and we're taking over, and we started, telling them some of the things we could do for them and meeting with some of the more, I would just say, well-heeled clients, they're like blown away because nobody really ever talked to them about that stuff. It's sort of like that old adage, and I hate using cliches, but like, you don't know what you don't know, right?
Right.
And so as a result of that, they got into their whole network themselves, and pretty soon the aunts and uncles and the cousins and, the best friends and everything, yeah, you need to talk to Joe, you need to talk to Mary. And pretty soon they're dragging people into the office physically to come talk to us. So it's been a very interesting experience seeing how even some very successful business owners making a lot of money that just are not really exposed to this level of information. So, I'm happy that we're, kind of cracking that open a little bit, at least in our little markets,
Yeah, absolutely. I love it. And, the more we can make people aware, the better it is for everyone. Right. And that's what I love about this industry is so many people in this industry have an abundance mindset where they're not withholding information. It's quite the opposite. They want to spread as much as they can and good information. Right. That's the other thing too, with, kind of the double-edged sword with technology is there's a lot of misinformation too. So it's obviously important that you know where you're getting your information from. So another thing you guys are big on, obviously you mentioned you're more in the residential space, but you're getting into the short-term rentals or have been in short-term rentals. I too am getting involved in that space as well, which is a very fascinating industry because it operates like no other real estate asset class does, right?
Yeah.
In commercial real estate, you want to get, your vacancy as low as possible, your occupancy as high as possible. Whereas with short-term rentals, there's actually a sweet spot where you're kind of more in the 60%, 60 to 70% range, because you want to be able to take advantage of rate changes and different things like that. What have been some keys for you guys in that space and building, that portfolio?
Well, yeah, your analogy about against commercial is interesting because it's like commercial is like the exact opposite, right? So I want a 5-year triple net, like I don't want to ever have to mess with it. And, I just want to like constant income.
Right.
And that's also what helps the value of commercial properties. So it's a different metric. The short term and medium term, and I guess before I go into it, I want to define medium term.
Yeah.
So short term would be 30 days or less, like your typical Airbnb, VRBO, things like that. Medium term is kind of more like traveling nurses, corporate relocations, people that are, wanting to move to a new city. There's been a lot of, since COVID, there's been a lot of movement around our country. Not going to get overly political about all the reasons why. I mean, everybody's got their own reasons, but there's a lot of people moving. And so sometimes they want to come for 2 or 3 or 5 or 6 months and check out that new place that they're thinking of moving to. So before committing and packing up all their stuff, right, let's go rent a furnished place for say 90 to 120 days.
Mm-hmm.
We'll that's enough time to get the feel of a city and kind of learn your way around a little bit, things like that. So there's definitely a market for that too. So we do both. We do what we call STR and MTR. And the way that we operate our properties is we look to see from a metric standpoint, if the you-know-what hit the fan and the bottom all fell out, right? Could we still LTR the property, long-term rent, put a 12-month tenant in there, and still make our payment, or at least very close to it? So that's sort of our base metric, right? So that way we know it's likely not going to be a loser. Then we look at, to answer your question about like, how do you really slice it? Well, we rely pretty heavily on software. So there's some really, really great analytical software out there that can tell you average nightly rates and, when the peaks are and when the valleys are, and, what the hot spots of a city are, even looking at bedroom and bath counts and things like that. So there is no hard and fast rule. You just kind of have to rely on the data. Whereas before, we were kind of shying away from some of the sexier areas in in the cities that we're in. There's 5 or 6 of them. We're kind of more shying towards the sexy areas because when we go to do a deal and we borrow it, they appraise well. But when you have something like really close to downtown and you fix it up nice and you put some nice furniture in there and you have like a little bit of a design flair and you create an environment that people want to rent, and it's much more of a nicer and more interesting experience than say a sterile hotel room, right? And typically it's less cost for more space. Right. So then, you're able to win. Now I will say that there are a lot of players getting into it, including institutional money. So the short-term rental space we've seen, especially just in the last, 8-12 months, become much more competitive. So is that good or bad? I mean, I don't know. It's kind of both, right? Like it forces us to have a much sharper pencil and be much more careful. But at the same time, I'm a capitalist at heart, right? And so I appreciate competition because it forces everybody to be better. It forces everybody to offer a better product. And so ultimately the consumer wins. So I think there's some of that going on in the STR industry right now as well. We're starting to see some really, really amazing stuff, like where people with just really brilliant creativity, creating like theme homes, like Halloween haunted homes, or, it's just like some of the stuff they do is, and stuff for kids, like a race car theme where all the beds are like little race cars, and like some really, really awesome creativity. And of course, the parents are paying for it and the kids are going, Dad, I want to stay there. Right. So it's great marketing. Yeah. And so I'm enjoying seeing the creativity that's happening in that space as well. But it's definitely a wilder ride. So I would not say it's for the faint of heart. If you're a newer investor, it does sound sexy and great and everything like that. But like I've got a personal property that I used to live in Indianapolis, and it's a great property. It's super close to downtown, and I've had months where it's grossed, $7,500 in a month. And last month I grossed $1,000. So like, it's a wild ride.
Yep.
And needless to say, I didn't like last month, but you kind of got to figure out your averages and things like that. So anyway, I think if you have the stomach for it, it's a good place to be.
Yeah, absolutely. It requires a lot more attention than even a long-term rental, right? Even if you're managing your own single family duplex, requires a lot more attention because you're constantly having people in and out, which means, more exposure to risk, right? Things getting damaged, just things being used more than they typically would by different people, right? Just new variables really at play. Like you said, kind of the ebb and flow of occupancy, where 1 month, you're, like, for instance, some of the ones I've been looking at in Scottsdale, right? You've got, like you said, some themed homes, you've got homes that are going now, you've got some that are going for 30, 50K a week for Super Bowl week, since it's in Phoenix this year. But that at the same time, in July, you'll probably maybe make, maybe a couple thousand at best, Yeah,
nobody wants to go to Phoenix in July.
Yeah. Well, you can play some of the best golf courses for dirt cheap because it's 100 degrees at the crack of dawn. So, if you're a hardcore golfer and you're on a budget, from what I understand, I'm not a hardcore golfer, but I've talked to some friends who are, and they say that, we'll still go down there because you can go play, TPC, which is normally $280 for a round. You can play it for $40.
Yeah. Well, you just got to get up early, beat the heat.
Yeah, but it's 110 degrees by 10 a.m. So
yeah, exactly.
But yes, it is a very, very fascinating space. And when you're in a city like Indianapolis, which is not typically a destination city, you have more of that ebb and flow, which is why, for getting into it, it's not a bad idea to think about the diversification of some destination cities, as well as, like you mentioned, kind of that medium term, right? Places like Indianapolis, even places like Memphis, where you have a lot of travel nurses and things like that.
Yeah.
And it just makes for, just an interesting business model, as well as you mentioned the institutions getting involved, which, forces you to, like you said, keep your pencil sharper, but also gives an opportunity, if you can build a solid portfolio, for a really nice exit, because institutions aren't coming in and buying one at a time. They're
Right.
looking for someone who has a portfolio that they can come in and acquire the whole thing. So, kind of a double-edged sword there.
Yeah, for sure. And you bring up something interesting, and the management of it is obviously much more complex. And management companies that manage STRs and MTRs charge a much higher percentage of the take for those efforts, and deservedly so. I mean,
Right.
they should be making more money. So you have to just figure that into your metrics. The other thing that's interesting too is like I live in Nashville, and there are some laws here that make it very difficult within Nashville proper to go and just buy something that's going to be an STR. Like there's a 30-day minimum. So you actually have to be an owner occupant. And so some of these properties that have like a carriage house or an ADU or whatever tend to become very, very attractive, because then you can still STR and live on the other side, and you're not sharing necessarily with your guests. But then again, when you're doing that, you yourself are in the management game, and that can be, it can be costly in terms of your time and effort and energy and things like that. So, not to say you couldn't hire somebody to manage it, but if it's right next door, you start going, well, I don't know. And your comment about institutional, buying multiple properties at once is absolutely valid, but I don't know. It's going to be interesting to see how the industry evolves, because when you get into cities that have some laws that make it more difficult to do that, that may be a difficult purchase, right? So, we'll have to see how it goes.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to keep an eye on it, as we move forward, right? Interest rates going up too, so making, purchasing single family residence more challenging. I mean, purchasing real estate in general more challenging, but so it will be a fascinating landscape to pay attention to. But this has been incredible. Loved all your insight. Obviously starting with all of the tax strategies, and then coming into what is now becoming one of my favorite asset classes, which is short-term rentals, which I never thought I would really get into. I kind of just was a consumer and didn't pay much attention. But, when something starts to blow up like it does, as a business person, you have to pay attention. So
yeah,
it's been awesome. But we'll go ahead and wind down here. We'll jump to the final five. First question: best advice you've gotten from a mentor?
Probably my favorite saying wasn't necessarily a mentor, but it was from Wayne Gretzky, is that you miss 100% of the shots that you don't take. So, it's like, how do you know if you don't try? We've done some really crazy, interesting deals that, my first inclination is like, well, why would we even want to do that? And now it's like, oh, I'm so glad we did that.
Absolutely. I love that. It's so true. What is about your career that makes you feel like you're fulfilling your why?
Well, God, there's so many nuances to that answer, but I love that we're helping other investors and helping other people to not waste money on taxes, helping other people to create better neighborhoods, better tenants, better experiences, and ultimately better lives for themselves and for their families. I mean, that's super. And we're doing it for ourselves too, and our families. So it's very rewarding all the way around.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. I love that. Favorite non-real estate or investment related book?
Favorite non-investment related book. I'm an old school guy. I think probably the one that affected me the most was the original Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill. I probably read
just
that.
Has absolutely stood the test of time. It's
timeless, incredible. And it's like I still have a copy of it, and I tend to once a year I'll pick up and read a couple chapters, and it's still relevant.
I love it.
Mm-hmm.
If you could have any superpower, what would it be?
Reading people's minds.
That would be very, very useful.
Yes.
I love it. Awesome. Last one. What's the best way for people to get a hold of you and learn more?
Just go to our main website is highreturnrealestate.com. And, you can see a little bit about what we're doing, our FAQ page, and there's a contact page there if you want to reach out, and we're happy to answer any questions.
Perfect. We'll link it in the show notes. Make it easy. Shecky, thank you so much for your time. This has been incredible.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you again for tuning in. Who do you know that wants more cash flow? Share this episode with them so you can grow your cash flow together. If you enjoyed the show, make sure you're subscribed on your platform of choice so you never miss a new episode. Go to KataniCapitalGroup.com to learn more.